Hey guys, so today we're going over the 22 Drytron list from LCS 9, which used the December 2020 ban list and lay out the most common ratios of Drytron cards, ritual cards, and a bunch of other cards. Now if you like these kind of videos, then make sure to like and subscribe so that I know that these videos are worthwhile. These do take a lot of time to prepare, so I'd obviously want to see the videos do well to continue doing these. So this one in particular was going to be longer than usual, so I'm actually going to break it into two parts, that way I can at least get something out for you guys earlier. This part 1 will cover all of the cards in the main deck, and part 2 that will come out shortly after will cover the cards in the extra deck and essentially the side deck, as I'll go over the most commonly played hand traps and back row hate. So make sure to subscribe to see part 2 of this video. I do want to give a big thanks to Simon from Frozen Card Gaming, also known as Jeebus McAsian on the Yu-Gi-Oh subreddit, for giving me pointers on how I could present the results. He recommended that I present the results by the Megalith variant and the non-Megalith variants, and I spoke with Pac as well and he said the same. So thanks to both of them on helping me get set up in the right direction. I'm going to provide the links to Simon's Drytron combo video and Pac's top cut Drytron deck profile in the description, so make sure to check those out. Anyways, let's just get started. Now I'm sure you've seen this pie graph before, but there were 22 Drytrons that participated at LCS 9 out of a total of 244 players. Now of those 22 lists, 14 were the Megalith build and 8 were the non-Megalith variants, with 2 Drytrons making it to top 16, one of each variant. There were actually 2 more Drytrons that finished top 32 in standing after Swiss. So here you see Pac's list with the Megalith cards finishing 4th after Swiss and top 16 at LCS 9. You can find the actual image on Luxury Gaming's Facebook page, but make sure to check out his profile on his channel too. Then you have Jesse Cotton's list that didn't play any of the Megalith stuff, but was more focused on putting up a Vantage ruler with some additional disruptions in hand. I'm not going to spend time on the profile, so feel free to just pause here and take a closer look. So now let's start with the deck size. It was a little all over the place to be honest, although most of the Megalith and non-Megalith variants did play 40 cards. The highest deck count was 47 cards with Lundridi's list, playing the Megalith cards of course, as well as even Dragoon. So I'm sure many of you are interested in which exact Drytron cards were played, as well as at what ratios. I'll be splitting the results by the Megalith and non-Megalith builds throughout the video, so the numbers at the top with the image of Bethor here represent the Megalith builds, and the numbers at the bottom with the image of Alpha represent the non-Megalith builds. Now keep in mind that there was a total of 14 Megalith variants and 8 non-Megalith variants, and I'll have that reminder at the very bottom there, because as we proceed throughout the video, you'll be seeing cards that weren't played in all lists, and the percentages are only referring to the common ratios, and I'm sure that sounds confusing, but it should make sense as we move along. Anyways, we see that Alpha, Zeta, and Gamma were played in all 22 Drytron lists, although in terms of ratios, they weren't that straightforward. Alpha was the only one where all lists played it at 3. As for Zeta, the Megalith build had it at 3 in 5 of the 14 lists, but the most common ratio for Zeta in the Megalith build was actually at 2, with 6 decks doing it this way. For the non-Megalith build, the most common ratio was at 3, being seen this way in 5 of the 8 lists. You'll notice that in both Pac and Jesse's lists, Zeta was played at 3. As for Gamma, the most common ratio in both variants was at 2, being seen that way in half of the list. The other alternative was to play Gamma at 1, which was the case for both Pac and Jesse's lists. Then you have Delta, which was played in all but one list in the Megalith build and in all of the non-Megalith builds. Now overall for all 22 Drytron lists, the most common ratio for Delta was 2. But if you look at it specifically for the Megalith build, Delta was played at 2 in 5 of the 13 decks that played it, but the most common ratio was actually at 1, with 6 decks doing it this way. For the non-Megalith builds, the most common ratio was indeed at 2, being seen that way in 5 of the 8 lists. Pac and Jesse both played 2 deltas as well. Lastly, Beta hardly saw any play, being seen in none of the Megalith builds. There were 3 non-Megalith builds that played Beta, and when they did, they all played it at just 1. Alright, so let's do the same but for the Drytron spells. Now Drytron Nova was played in all of the 22 Drytron lists, and the most common ratio was at 3, except for this one list in the non-Megalith list that played it at 2. Then we have the Drytron Ritual spell, which was also seen in all of the Drytron lists. The most common ratio wasn't as straightforward, as 64% of Megalith build and 75% of the non-Megalith build played it at 1, while playing it at 2 was the other option. Pac's Megalith version did play 2 Meteonis Drytron, while Jesse played it at just 1. Lastly, we have Fafnir, the Drytron Field spell, which was played in all but one Drytron list in the non-Megalith build. Among the decks that did play this card, the most common ratio was at 3 in both variants, although some did play it at 2. Next, let's cover the Herald monsters, at least the main deck ones. So as you can see by the numbers, the Drytron list that played the Megalith cards didn't play the Herald cards too often. We'll start with Orange Light, which negates monster effects, and among the 5 Megalith lists that played this card, 80% of them played it at 3, and of the 7 non-Megalith lists that just played Orange, 86% of them played it at 3. Pack and Jesse both played Orange at 3 as well. Purple and Green didn't see much play, although when they were played, they were just played at 1, as you see here. Jesse actually played 1 Purple in his non-Megalith list, which can stop trap activations. So for Herald of Perfection, the 4 Megalith lists that ran it did play it at 1, but for the non-Megalith builds, only 1 of the 3 lists that played it used Perfection at 1, while playing it at 2 more often. Neither Pack or Jesse played Perfection, although Pack did play Herald of Ultimateness, and he was just one of the 2 Drytron lists that played that card. Now we can cover the most common ratio of the Megalith monsters. So Bethor and Full were the only Megalith monsters that were played in all of the lists that played Megalith cards. Bethor was most commonly played at 1, although Pack actually played it at 2 because he liked that double pop with Full. Speaking of Full, half of the Megalists played this at 2, while 5 lists played it at 1, and 2 lists even played it at 3. As for Ophiel, Och, and Haggith, they were all played at just 1 in the list that played them, and Pack played the Ophiel, but not the Och and the Haggith. Now let's cover some of the other ritual monsters commonly played in Drytrons. Cyber Angel Ben 10 is of course a must, being played in all 22 Drytron lists and at 3 in all cases, because you want to loop Ben 10 as much as possible and get those searches. The remaining ritual monsters were all just played at 1 if the list played them. Cyber Angel Natasha was played in all but 1 of the Megalith and non-Megalith lists, but this card is honestly crazy for breaking the board, where you take control of your opponent's monsters, and you can also gain life points with this card too. The other 2 Drytron boss monsters didn't see much play, and only in the non-Megalith list when it did. Jesse was one of the 6 lists to play Draconids actually. Alright, this is the last bit of the main deck monsters, and then we can move on to the spells. So we see Manju of the 10,000 hands in all of the Megalith lists, and in half of the non-Megalith list. The most common ratio was playing it at 1, as seen in 64% of the Megalith builds and 75% of the non-Megalith builds. Some still played Manju at 2 or 3 though. The remaining monsters you see here were all played at 1 if they were played at all. Dawn Knight was very common, being seen in all but 1 Megalith list and in all but 2 non-Megalith lists, which is used to equip to Union Carrier, and then you send the carrier off so that Dawn Knight can act as a Foolish Burial. Chaos Valkyria was pretty common too, being seen in 11 of the 14 Megalith builds only, and Eva was seen in just 4 of the 14 Megalith builds and in 6 of the 8 non-Megalith builds, which gives you those searches for extra disruption after being discarded for the Herald cards. Pack and Jesse both played Eva as well. Then we have Vanity's Ruler, which is more commonly seen in the non-Megalith builds, although there was still one list that played the Megalith cards and Vanity's Ruler on top of that. Prevents your opponent from special summoning, so once you get that out with a couple other interruptions on field and or hand, then you're in a pretty good spot. Okay, and finally for part 1 of this breakdown, we can move on to these spells. A little weird for me seeing Cyber Emergency being played in something else other than Cyber Dragons, but this card is definitely a must and was seen in all 22 Drytron lists. Most commonly played at 3, although there were 3 Megalith lists that played it at 2 instead. Preparation of Rites was another spell that was played in all Drytron lists, and was played at 3 in almost all cases, except for the 1 non-Megalith list that played it at 2. Then the remaining spells you didn't see that often in the Drytron list. Dawn of the Herald was generally played at just 1 if it was played, and Pre-Preparation of Rites was played at 3 in the few lists that played it. Something interesting I noticed was there were also 4 lists with Megalith cards that played 3 of Chaos Base, as well as the baby Chaos Dragons, so that was kind of cool. I'm curious of how well that works with this deck. Lastly, I think it's worth noting that the general spells like Foolish Burial was seen in essentially every Drytron list, and Terraforming was pretty close to being seen in 14 of the 22 Drytron lists. Alright guys, so that's it for part 1 of this Drytron breakdown from LCS 9, covering the cards in the main deck. Stay tuned for part 2 that will come up very soon, which will cover the cards in the extra and side deck. That's it for me, take care guys.